Hello friends, my name is Marinés, and today I'm going to be talking about my 2020 year in reading, reviewing my 2020 goals, and talking about what my goals for 2021 will be. As we all know, to state the obvious, 2020 was a very wild and weird year for many of us. I had made goals at the beginning of 2020 and I started the year January, February, like really well in terms of completing those goals. And then everything just kind of went to hell. I truly did not even think about my goals again until like November. And when I went back to see what those goals had been, I was like, oh no. I have talked about before on this channel how I don't really always read for escapism. When I am stressed out, I tend to not be able to read because I jump into fiction feelings first. So if a work of fiction is making me stressed out and I'm stressed out because of like life in the world, it's not a good experience for me. So in terms of reading, 2020 was sort of a feast or famine year. There were some months, I think April, May, and June, that I read either no books at all or just one or two books in those months. And then there were months where I did much better in terms of like keeping pace with what a normal year is for me in my reading. And then in December, I did a challenge where I read 31 books in the month, which helped catch me up a heck of a lot in terms of what I wanted to accomplish in my reading year. In addition to being on this roller coaster with my reading and, having some months where I wasn't reading at all and some months where I was reading a lot, I also just didn't do a good job tracking my reading in 2020. The passage of time, especially in those first pandemic and lockdown months and through the summer when I was unemployed, like it is honestly all a blur to me. And you'll see it all over my Goodreads reviews, and I've said it in videos where I'm just like, I read this at some point in the pandemic summer or the pandemic spring. Like I don't even know when I read certain things because it's all lost in this like haze of like days bleeding into each other. And I wasn't doing a good job tracking. I was so happy to be reading that I wasn't worried about like then running and tracking on Goodreads or anything like that, marking things as read. I did my best at the end of the year to like look back and think about all of the things that I had read and catch up with marking it as read. And then I did like a quick survey of the read to just capture certain data points, but it isn't very extensive and it definitely isn't to the level of how I have tracked my reading in years past. Another really interesting thing about 2020 is that I felt like I was more likely to put down books that I wasn't enjoying and never come back to them. Almost since the beginning of this channel. I think like the second video I ever made on this channel was probably like in defense of negative reviews. And in 2020, I made a video about why I read books that I feel like I'm not gonna like. And again, in defense of negative reviews and sort of their role and their purpose and why I enjoy making them and why they are part of the content that I make. And so that was a really interesting video for me to make in a year where I wasn't pushing myself to read books that I normally would have finished and reviewed and been fine with reading because I didn't have the brain space for it. If I was encountering books where I was like, no, thank you, it was an immediate put down with like no mind to return to them. I do generally put books down pretty frequently, but it's more like trying a couple of pages and seeing if that's what I'm in the mood for, and if not, kind of moving on, but knowing and thinking I might get back to that book at some other time when it is the right time. This felt more like truly DNFing. This felt more like only pursuing things that I thought I would enjoy, which again is so weird for me. It is not typically how I read. And I think because of that, I ended up giving a lot more 3, 4, and 5-star ratings than 1 or 2-star ratings. In 2020, I gave 2 1-star ratings. One was for The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and the other was for a reread, The Selection by Kira Cass. And I gave 4 2-star ratings. The Dinner List by Rebecca Searle, Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare, Naked in Death by J.D. Robb, and Career of Evil by Robert Galbraith. So that's it in a nutshell. Weird reading mood. Sometimes I couldn't read at all, only looking for books that like I could even with for a lot of the year. And so a lot of books that I really genuinely enjoyed and loved. Okay, so let's look back at my goals for 2020. First, I know I've talked about this before in other goal setting sorts of videos, but I am somebody who sets reading goals. And to me, this is less about like the quantity of books that I'm reading per se, but it is more about like a time management tool. I like to prioritize reading. It's something that I enjoy and that is important to me. And so by setting a reading goal, I know that I am carving out enough time for reading and that I am not over dedicating time to things like social media scrolling or video games or TV or movies, which are all things that I enjoy, but I want to make sure that I am keeping a balance and that I'm managing my time correctly. I always set my reading goal in 3 parts. The bottom tier is 52 books in a year, which is the base level of what I feel happy with in terms of making enough time for reading. A book a week is personally what I think I should be striving for at a base level. I usually do read more than that, so my middle goal is sort of like what I've done on average year over year, which is 72 books a year, 6 books a month. And then I always set a stretch goal because I think that it is important to have stretch goals. And these are things that if you don't accomplish them, it's not like a beating yourself up sort of thing, but it is something to strive for and say like in a really, really amazing reading year, this is what I would be able to accomplish. And that stretch goal for me is 100 books. For the first time ever, I hit 100 books in 2019. And in 2020, I ended up reading 110 books. So again, my best reading year, even though there were months I didn't read any books at all. When that ended up happening, I was like, oh, okay, wow. Like, I don't know, that it is a little bit wild to me. And the other portion of it is that now that I've had 2 years in a row where I have achieved 100 books, I started to think about if I need to shift this goal like higher. Is this now a thing where I can read to this level year over year? But I decided that for 2021, I'm going to keep it the way I've always kept it. I don't want to overexert myself. And the truth is that if I only read 52 books in 2021, I would still be happy with that because a book a week is like a really fine pace, especially considering everything else that I have going on in my life. If I'm still working full time and doing other hobbies and planning BookNet Fest, in whatever capacity we can do that and all of that, if I'm still able to read a book a week, like that is amazing. So 52 is still my base. 72 is what I will set my actual Goodreads goal at because that is what I typically think I'm going to achieve, and then 100 will remain my stretch goal. Another one of my 2020 goals was to read more nonfiction, and I set a number to this as well, again as more of a pacing thing so that I could make sure that I was including these books in my reading overall at a pace that would help me achieve this goal. So I said 1 nonfiction book a month, but I actually ended up reading 18 nonfiction books this year. In order that I read them, we were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austen Channing Brown, You Never Forget Your First by Alexis Coe, Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson, Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo by Zora Neale Hurston, How Not to Get Shot and Other Advice from White People by D.L. Hughley, The Alchemy of Us by Anissa Ramirez, Big Friendship, How We Keep Each Other Close by Amina Toussaint and Anne Friedman, So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, The Beast, Riding the Rails and Dodging Narcos on the Migrant Trail by Oscar Martinez, Shit Actually by Lindy West, Wandering in Strange Lands, A Daughter of the Great Migration Reclaims Her Roots by Morgan Jerkins, The End of Everything, Astrophysically Speaking by Katie Mack, Apple, Skin to the Core by Eric Gansworth, Long Time Coming, Reckoning with Race in America by Michael Eric Dyson, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America by Ijeoma Oluo, Down Along with That Devil's Bones, A Reckoning with Monuments, Memory, and the Legacy of White Supremacy by Connor Town O'Neill, and Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby. I also said that I wanted to read more short stories and more science fiction, picking a book from one of those 2 categories each month, and I think my intention was to read like 6 short story collections and 6 science fiction books. But that breakdown ended up being more like 2 short story collections and 6 brand new sci-fi stories, along with 5 rereads that I did of sci-fi books. It's like not too bad. I did not hit that goal, I would say, necessarily. I mean, technically I probably did, but I think the spirit of the thing was probably to read more short story collections that I did rather than those 2, which were Orange World by Karen Russell and The World Doesn't Require You by Ryan Amilcar Scott. As for sci-fi, I read Axiom's End by Lindsay Ellis. I reread An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green, and then later on in the year read the second book in this duology, A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor. Cia Martinez and The Moonlit Beginning of Everything by Raquel Vasquez-Gilliland. The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. The First Sister by Lyndon A. Lewis. I reread the Hunger Games trilogy in this year. And then I also read the first 5 books in the In Death series, which is a mystery series with a really strong romance element, but it is set in a nearest future, so it's got that sci-fi element of it as well. So it's kind of like an in-betweeny thing. So not too bad on the sci-fi end of things, not great on the short story collections end of things, but I've decided that I'm not going to actually carry this goal forward into 2021. I consider myself an omnivore when it comes to reading. I try to read a little bit of everything, and even the genres that are not like my favorite, like thrillers or sci-fis or horrors, I like to make sure that I am at least dabbling in them, because that is part of the fun in reading for me, is like reading very widely and stepping outside of my comfort zone and making sure that I have like a pulse on what is happening in the larger like publishing world and in stories in general. So that's kind of like the purpose behind setting goals like this, is to make myself step outside of my comfort zone and like delve into an area that maybe I hadn't before. And these are not things that I will maintain year over year. Like I don't want to suddenly switch my reading to become majority sci-fi, but in another few years I'll set this goal again to just like dive back into a genre where I don't typically read. For 2021, I want to switch up my focus a little bit and work harder to read more translated works and poetry collections. So I'm going to say again that between these two categories, I'd like to read 12 works. So every month I want to be reading either a poetry collection or a work in translation. My next goal was to read 24 books of the month. And so that's a pace of 2 books of the month every month. My thinking was that I wanted to cut down on my backlist of books of the month because I wasn't doing a good job keeping pace with what I was taking in. So 24, 2 books a month allowed me to account for the new book that I was receiving that month and one on my backlist. Like that was the only way that I figured I could like get ahead of it. January and February, amazing. I did so good. The rest of the year, not quite a pace of 2 books a month. I read a handful more in December to try and like boost up this number. And I ended up reading 12 for the year, 12 books of the month. I didn't even really keep up with the pace that I had received them. So this is pretty much not a success. Me doing everything I can to call it a fail. I'm not actually being hard on myself, because the fact that I read anything in 2020, let alone 110 books, is amazing. So I'm really happy with these 12 books. So those books were The Dinner List by Rebecca Searle, Goodbye Vitamin by Rachel Kong, The Proposal by Jasmine Guillory, Things in Jars by Jess Kidd, Big Friendship, How We Keep Each Other Close by Amina Tissot and Anne Friedman, Beach Read by Emily Henry, One to Watch by Kate Stamen London, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, Transcendent Kingdom by Ya Jessie, In a Holidays by Christina Lauren, The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson, and The Boyfriend Project by Farrah Rashan. I am carrying this goal forward into 2021. I would like to read 2 books of the month every month. I think that that is a fair pace, even all things considered, the fact that I didn't actually do it in 2020. I think that it was an achievable goal in any other year, or at least something that I want to strive for, because even if I fall short and I end up reading another 12 or 16 or 18, that is like slowly kind of picking away at this backlist that I have, and I'm still enjoying the subscription a lot. I talked about this in a recent video. I love my books of the month. I'm enjoying the books from them that I pick up. I just kind of want to read them at a faster clip. So I'm bringing this goal with me forward into 2021, 2 books of the month every month. I also mentioned my rereading for my 2020 goals. It's not a goal of mine to reread. I just know that I am going to reread, and it is something that I turn to for comfort. I enjoy rereading. I've talked about rereading plenty, and I have a video about why specifically I reread. And I set myself a pace of 24 books reread in the year. So again, 2 books a month that I was like sort of allowed to reread. I do this because again, it's a pacing thing for me. If I'm rereading more than 2 books a month, I want to make sure that I'm like clocking it and that I'm giving myself enough time to pick up new fiction as well. In 2020, I ended up rereading 28 books. At the very beginning of the year, I read all 4 of the Robert Galbraith books, and I don't really want to talk about them a lot because Robert Galbraith is a pen name for J.K. Rowling. What I found was something that was a lot more problematic and less entertaining than I originally thought. And it might very well be that like sort of the outside stuff was informing the reading experience, but that's fine by me. That's the way the world works. And it also made it that much easier to not move on with the series. The next book is out and I have no interest in reading it and I'm fine with it. And I think I actually adjusted some of my star ratings on these down. I also reread the 3 Hunger Games books and we did a podcast episode about it. One of the very few podcast episodes we did in 2020 was about rereading the Hunger Games in 2020, and it held up really well. I enjoyed rereading those. I was a little bit worried because it had been many years since I'd done that, but I found that it truly did hold up, and it lends itself so well to discussion and breaking down themes and just sort of like picking apart the layers that either Suzanne Collins wrote in there or that you can interpret in there. I also reread the Fairyland series, and I actually reread the first 3 in March, and then I got laid off and I didn't read anything for a very long time. And then at the end of the year in December, I went back and reread the first 3 again and then finished by rereading 4 and 5. Basically, I reread books in the Fairyland series 8 times in 2020. I also reread The Selection by Kiera Cass, An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green, 3 books in the Mercy Thompson series, 5 books in the Kate Daniel series, Jane Eyre, and as always, as I do every year, I reread Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice. Rereading Jane Eyre was actually a 2020 goal of mine because I hadn't reread it since 2017, I believe, and I'd like to get to that once every couple of years, and I did end up doing that in December in 2020, but I did it, so I reread Jane Eyre. For some other broad categories in my reading, I read 3 classics, 14 books that I categorized as contemporary or literary fiction, 36 fantasies, 2 horrors, 11 mystery thrillers, 18 nonfiction, 13 romance, 11 sci-fi, and 2 short story collections. 45 of the books that I read were published in 2020, 8 were published in 2019, 15 were published in 2018, an additional 35 were published some other time in the 2000s, leaving 7 that were published earlier than that. 81 of the 110 books that I read in 2020 were adult novels, 10 were middle grade, and 19 were young adult. 67 of these books were written by authors of color or queer authors, or otherwise features characters of color or queer characters. Again, I didn't track very deeply in 2020, so I am missing information on which of these books feature representation other than what I've mentioned, but I wanted to at least confirm what it felt like to me, and that was that when I'm reaching for a book, more often than not, it features an element of what we sort of broadly talk about as being diverse. Aside from the goals that I missed out on, I did at least try in each category, and I am very happy overall with this breakdown. My overall rating for all of my books was 3.8 stars. I found some books that could possibly be new favorites, which you'll hear about in my best of the year video coming up here soon, but in general, just a really fantastic reading year in 2020. To summarize, my 2021 goals are 72 books in a year, 2 books of the month every month, 1 translated work or poetry collection every month, and to that I will add keeping a pace of rereading 2 books every month. I want to try and continue to read 1 nonfiction book every month as well. That worked really well for me, and I feel like I'm finding my footing with nonfiction, and it will get to a point where I won't necessarily need to make this a goal. It will just naturally become part of my reading, but I think I want to make this a goal for 1 more year to really cement it. And then the last thing that I want to do that will overlap with a lot of these other goals is to make sure that I'm reading from my own TBR. So I did a huge unhaul project in 2020, and so I have this brand new physical TBR, which is separate from all of the books that I've read that are behind me. So I want to make sure that I'm picking from this selection of books that is in front of me from my TBR. But in total, I think I want to read 30 books from this TBR shelf in 2021. So that's a lot of big, lofty goals. If 2020 taught me anything, it's that it's fine if you don't reach all of your goals. So we're resetting, we're shooting for the moon again, and hopefully I will have as successful a reading year this year as I had in 2020, with the added bonus of checking off a few more of these goals. That's it for me today. Let's chat down in the comments about what some of your goals are for 2021. If you've read any of the books I've mentioned, as always, we can chat about them down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Anyone want to come pick up that mess?